Uh, Thank you so much, Fahad, for being here. And if you would like to start sharing your PowerPoint, please feel free to do so. And I think you're mute.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I am.
Okay, cool.
Well, let me just start it. And then you said just to start briefly with some words of introduction
Yes, please.
before I dive into the introduction. Well, thank you, Lale. Thank you for your invitation to speak here. Thank you for your kind words. Totally unnecessary and embarrassing, of course, but I appreciate them. I'm especially grateful to speak as a part of this series. Some of you might know I did an MA at Exeter many years ago. I think I finished it in 2006. And actually, the project that I'm sharing with you today began at Exeter. I was always interested in writing something about the dhow trade. Some of you here may know my grandfather was a dhow captain, and so I grew up with a sense of that world, very vague sense of that world, but also a sense that there was a lot about that world that I just did not understand and didn't know, and I wanted the chance to explore more of. And so when I ended up at Exeter as an MA student, I started digging into the world of the dhow, and I did some things that ended up as a MA thesis over there. I went on to graduate school here in the United States at Duke University, thinking I'd continue the project on dhows, but I ended up tabling it for a few different reasons. The first reason was I started becoming interested in other things. I became interested in law and capitalism, and I wasn't 100% sure that the dhow trade, at least as I understood it then, was going to let me really dive deep into those sorts of things. The other reason was that I became keenly aware of my own proximity to the project, and that I was too young of a historian, too green of a historian to actually take on the project. I wasn't confident enough and I wasn't seasoned enough to be able to interpret the sorts of things that I was seeing. And so I ended up pursuing a different kind of project, the project that became A Sea of Debt. And I hadn't planned on writing about debt at all, although I had been interested in debt because of my work on the maritime trade and the pearl dive. And I thought, okay, there's a lot of debt here. And then I noticed there was a lot of debt in sort of East Africa as well. And I thought, maybe there's something here. And then as I started going around and looking for materials to work with, I came across all of the debt waraqas, and then I thought, okay, surely there's a story to be written here. And that's the project that became A Sea of Debt, and that took me down a rabbit hole of my own. But the dhow project was always there. I'd always sort of kept it there, and I kept on collecting material. And it's only after I published A Sea of Debt and I was sort of forced to begin thinking about what my next book project was going to be. I was forced to start producing for my book project before I came up for tenure. That's when I started putting words on paper, and I'm glad that I did. I had to sort of commit myself to something of a project, but I didn't really have a sense of what the project would be until much later, and you'll see over the course of this presentation why that is. Now I can say with some confidence, but also with some sadness, that the book is done. It's in production. And so I hope you will all see it in print by the end of the summer or early fall. And it's sad because like as I was telling Lala earlier, I really loved writing this book and I loved working on this project, and I was really sad to let it go. Not sad to let it go because of some perfectionism or something like that I thought I'm not a perfectionist at all. In fact, I'm the exact opposite of it. But because I truly loved working on it, and I wasn't ready to stop working on it. Anyway, it's done now. I'm moving on to other things. There are a few different ideas in the mix. Some of them are big sort of world histories. Others are much more sort of micro-focused studies, and I'll sort of hint at it as we go through the talk. Anyway, I didn't come here to speak about myself. I came to talk about this book project. And so let me begin with a vignette in June of 1994, actually. So in June of 1994, 226-ton ship quietly pulled into a small harbor on the northern coast of Kuwait, slowly making its way into a shipyard. This ship, the Fath al-Khair, it had been there before, nearly 40 years before, actually. It had once had a life as one of Kuwait's fleet of ocean-going dhows, but it was sold off in 1952 as the dhow trade died off and oil exports soared in a post-World War II economic boom. In 1993, the year it was identified as a former Kuwaiti vessel, it was plying the coastal trade between Iran and the UAE, one of the many afterlives that the ship had. The Kuwaiti historian, Yaqub al-Hajji, was in the UAE when colleagues there told him of a Kuwaiti dhow that was still around. He went, he inspected it, confirmed, and by the next summer, the summer of 1994, the Kuwaiti government purchased the dhow and sent it on its final voyage back home. A team of shipwrights worked on refurbishing the Fath al-Khair for nearly 2 years, and in 1996, the dhow was hauled to the Kuwait Scientific Center, where it was unveiled to the public to much fanfare. And there was a whole ceremony with the Emir of Kuwait there, and the last captain of the Fath al-Khair, actually my grandfather over there on the left. The timing of the Fath al-Khair's discovery, at least for the Kuwaiti government, could not have been better. During the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the last known pre-oil dhow of Kuwait, the Muhallab, had been burned down outside of the National Museum. As far as the Kuwaiti government knew, there were no more pre-oil dhows, genuine dhows that had been left. They were left with only replicas that had been built much later. And so the Fath al-Khair's discovery came at a time when the Kuwaiti government was grasping for some symbol of a national past after this moment of national crisis. And this dhow, the Fath al-Khair in particular, became a symbol of Kuwait's autochthonous and autonomous past. These narratives that were projected onto the Fath sit very uneasily with the dhow's own past, actually. It's a narrative in which the sea is a place in which the nation could prove its fortitude. That's the maritime history that we get in Kuwait. The sea is a place where the nation sails out and sails back after committing all these acts of bravery, or engaging in these acts of bravery. And part of that emerges from an approach to national history in which the sea is a backdrop and which land is the principal stage of history. But where have these terrestrial histories taken us? Not very far. In the literature on the history of the Middle East, the Gulf is something of a poor cousin, and I don't think I need to convince anybody in this room of that. With almost no exceptions, it's entirely absent from the narrative of Middle Eastern history until the advent of an oil economy post-World War II. And for decades, historians of the Gulf have struggled to situate their work within a grand narrative of Middle Eastern history that's been dominated by the Ottoman Empire and post-Ottoman societies. Sometimes they turned inwards, further reinforcing the notion that the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula were at best parochial. And it's only recently that they've worked to connect the peninsula to historical events and processes in Egypt, Turkey, and the Levant. And of course, there's a much more recent move of historians, which I align myself with, whose premise to reading and writing the history of the Gulf is based on a somewhat sort of simple standpoint, that the history of the Gulf doesn't play out in the Middle East alone, that it plays out around the Indian Ocean world. The Gulf history is Indian Ocean history. But to get us there, we have to unmoor that history from the land and disaggregate it from the nation. We have to untie the bundle that history comes packaged in, and then we have to recalibrate our expectations as to where this history is supposed to play out. Doing that allows us to do more than read the history of a dhow like the Fath al-Khair or even a place like Kuwait. It allows us to do a couple of things. First, it allows us to bring the history of the Gulf more closely into a conversation on oceanic history, a conversation that it's actually largely been left out of. So Indian Ocean historians also do not really embrace the Gulf as Indian Ocean history, in part because the production on Gulf history has not really engaged with that conversation. But more importantly, it allows us to unfurl the histories of places like Arabia and the Gulf and Kuwait, and to see new frontiers for writing the history of the Middle East. Across the water are other life worlds, other histories that have been severed from the conversation on the Middle East, and that have been left on the sidelines of the historiographies of Arabia, Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. One of the ways to get there is to get on the deck of the dhow itself, to continue a venerable tradition of historians who have written world history through voyages. And it's become like one of my favorite genres of world historical writing, the voyage. And I could have written a book on the Fath al-Khair, and I would have, had it not been for a chance encounter with another dhow. The story of this dhow was tucked away in a Malabar teak chest in a suburban neighborhood in Kuwait. It belonged to the nakhoda Abdul Majid al-Faylichawi. I'm sorry, it's al-Faylikawi, but in the Kuwaiti dialect it's al-Faylichawi, so you'll often hear me say al-Faylichawi. And I managed to find it through a series of serendipitous events, and I'm happy to tell the story in Q&A, essentially just through a sort of network of people. Inside this chest were, first and foremost, 3 logbooks detailing the trips the nakhoda took between 1920 and 1938 on his ship. We don't know the formal name of the ship, actually, but we do know that it was informally known as al-A'waj, or the Crooked. The dhow had been modified from a lower tonnage carrier, and with the added planks, it lacked the sleek lines that most sort of pre-designed sort of high-capacity dhows had. Thus, it appeared crooked. Alongside the logbooks were also maps, accounts, navigational instruments, and lots of books that al-Faylichawi had collected over his lifetime. Read as part of a national history, this collection is difficult to make sense of. Very little of it has anything to do with Kuwait proper. It sails out beyond the horizon of the nation. Read from the terrestrial Gulf and Middle East too, sources like these seem adrift. They move between parts of the world that ostensibly have nothing to do with the Middle East, and they spend quite a bit of time in the spaces in between these worlds. The collection challenges us then to figure out how to place it, and more importantly, how to write about the spaces and worlds inhabited. So let's dig into it, shall we? The most obvious place to start is the logbook, which captains like al-Faylichawi called the Roznama. Roznamas like this mapped out in very tangible terms a movement between the Gulf, India, South Arabia, and East Africa. It's worth reading and thinking about more closely because it's through the act of moving alongside the Faylichawi's dhow around the Western Indian Ocean that we can gather the pieces of the histories that animated it, threading the needle through Arabia, India, and Africa. Over the course of my book, I follow the logbook and I take the reader from one port to another on a season's voyage on the Crooked. We move with al-Faylichawi and alongside many other dhows from Kuwait to Basra, where they loaded their principal cargo. So Kuwait to Basra up here, where they loaded their principal cargo, the dates of southern Iraq, which they then would transport to markets around the Western Indian Ocean. They would sail from Basra down the coast of Persia and into India, into Karachi, Gujarat, Bombay, and down the Konkan and Malabar coasts. In the book, the Crooked then sails back up from Calicut up to Goa. From Goa, crosses the Arabian Sea, makes its way back up to Muscat, then across to the Persian coast, and sort of bounces back and forth between the Arab and Persian coasts, and finally making it back to Kuwait at the end of the season in early June. But I also set this voyage against the backdrop of several hundred years of history, a history of circulation of merchants, statesmen, ships, goods, and texts between the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, Africa, and India. I would have liked to rely on the Roznama alone to narrate the voyage. But as anybody who has spent any time with logbooks knows, they do not lend themselves very well to this sort of a thing. The entries on the voyage itself are often terse, repetitive, and really not very revealing at all. There are times where the nakhoda does give us bursts of color. He does things like draw pictures, and you see some of these here. I especially like this sort of coastal landscape that he draws over here. He mentions other nakhodas by name, but most of the time, what he and others give us is a very brief description of their position, wind, current, and sometimes only the vaguest description of what they were doing, not on board the dhow itself, but what they were doing at port. We unloaded our cargo, we loaded our cargo, things like that. So to open up these entries and animate them a little more, I draw on different collections. As we sail around the Indian Ocean on Al-Fayed dhow, we meet the different actors he did business with, and we learn about the connected worlds they inhabit. I rely principally on the collections of two merchants. The date merchant, Muhammad al-Matrouk, pictured over here, who's based in Basra, and then the merchant banker, Muhammad Salim al-Sdayrawi, based out of Bombay over here, both of whom were Al-Fayed contemporaries. Between the two of them, there are about 25,000 pages of correspondence, not between the two of them, meaning between the two collections. There are about 25,000 pages of correspondence, accounts, and other materials spanning a very, very, very broad geography. I also draw on the letters of one traveling Kuwaiti merchant in the Indian Ocean, Rashid bin Ali al-Asrusi, but it's a much sort of smaller collection. As different Gulf rulers signed over their defense and foreign relations to the British Raj, Gulf traders fanned out into British-held ports. Of course, their presence in British-held ports, or Indian ports especially, predate these agreements. But after the agreements, we see much more sort of sustained waves of movement. They clustered around a few main ports, though. Karachi and Bombay, both of which formed part of the Bombay Presidency, and later Calicut, though the presence in Calicut was really quite minimal. They also made their way to Aden, which of course also formed part of the Bombay Presidency. So actually, most of their presence, you can say, was in the Bombay Presidency itself. And part of that must have been because of access to British political offices in different Indian ports. By establishing themselves in places like Karachi and Bombay and Aden, they could tap into the legal and diplomatic infrastructure that would facilitate the movement of money, obligations between the Gulf and Indian Ocean. But the process might have also been motivated by a desire to take advantage of the technologies of empire and colonial capitalism in the region. From these nodes, Gulf merchants could access a growing infrastructure of communications, finance, and transportation, and they did. They made regular use of technologies like the telegraph, which they used to communicate prices and orders to one another, and they made extensive use of steamships too, and as I'll say later, they actually ran their own steamship companies, and they used steamships to send cargoes of goods to one another, all sorts of different kinds of goods. And with the emergence of banks in British India and later in the Gulf, these merchants would use the banking infrastructure to move money between different accounts. Eastern Bank, for example, had just set up a branch in Basra in 1915, just a decade before Al-Fayed set sail, or the year that I follow him setting sail. So rather than think of the world of colonial capitalism and Indian Ocean trade as being somehow separate from one another, I want to suggest that the two, the world of the bank and the world of the bazaar, are actually deeply bound up in one another. Instead of talking about this in the abstract, let us ground it in the voyage. So after about 3 weeks of sailing out of Basra, the Crooked arrived in Karachi, where dozens of other Gulf dhows were loading sacks of rice and other grains. By the late 19th century, Karachi had emerged as the major exporter of grains, not just in South Asia, but actually anywhere east of the Suez Canal. It was the largest exporter of grains anywhere in the Eastern world. It lay downriver from the Indus Valley, South Asia's breadbasket, and over time, it was connected to those grain-producing areas inland by rail as well. The mass export of grains from ports like Karachi made them more easily accessible in the Gulf. As Gulf merchants in Karachi, and there were dozens of Gulf merchants in Karachi, and their Gujarati partners, whom they did a lot of business with, directed the flow of rice and grain to Basra, and from there to places around the Gulf. We might thus think of Gulf cuisine as actually being shaped by this historically specific moment, a moment in which rice, which is a staple in the Gulf, and other grains became much more easily accessible, much more affordable than they might have been in the past, just because of the mass production and export. So for about 10 days, the crew of the Crooked unloaded their cargoes of dates in that port and then sailed on to ports around Gujarat, Porbandar, which they called Khormiyan, and Veravel. And 2 days after leaving Veravel, they arrived in the other major port city, in Bombay. Felichawi and his crew spent an unusually long time in Bombay, actually, the entire month of November and then some. Only 5 days of that month were spent unloading the cargoes of dates that he had carried from Basra, some of which he had actually already sold in Karachi and Gujarat. He also lost a few days in the shipyard. The Cookit had suffered some damage along the way and he needed repairs, and there was a dhow repair yard in Bombay that people availed themselves of. But for the most part, he spent his time in Bombay arranging for cargoes for the onward journey, which would take him to Calicut before heading back up to the Gulf. In the weeks he spent in Bombay, Al-Farichawi would have come to know the Gulf merchant community there very well, and there are many to get to know. Bombay was widely known as the principal market for Gulf pearls, and Gulf pearl merchants in Bombay sometimes amassed fabulous wealth from the pearl trade. The merchant Jassim Ibrahim, for example, was one of the pearl kings of Bombay. His family owned thousands of acres of date plantations in Basra as well, by the way. And Jassim himself did quite well, and he bought a beautiful home in a posh suburb of Bombay. You see it right here. It's a really stunning piece of architecture, designed by a Parsi architect, purpose-built by a Parsi architect. He was, of course, one of many Gulf merchants in Bombay who made their money off the pearl trade. There were dozens like him. And then there were some who had little to do with pearls and focused their business activities in other sectors. There's the Al-Bassam family of Unayza in the Saudi interior, who had members of the family in Bombay who were involved in the textile trade. They moved to Bombay in the late 19th century and embedded themselves in the textile manufacturing sector. Some actually migrated to Calcutta to embed themselves in textile manufacturing there. The Al-Bassam family, of course, became famous for their popular red and white checkered shmagh, the shmagh al-Bassam, which is a staple of the Gulf sartorial scene to this day. There's nothing more popular than the shmagh al-Bassam. But actually, Gulf merchants in Bombay did business in a remarkable range of textiles, all of which found eager buyers in the Gulf. And part of the reason they were able to do that is because over the course of the 19th century, Bombay became a major textile manufacturing port. There had always been textile manufacturing coming out of places like Gujarat, of course. This is long predates the rise of Bombay. But what we see in Bombay in the 19th century is the rise of industrial textile manufacturing, something to sort of rival and complement, of course, textile manufacturing in Britain itself. And as these goods were making their way around, as pearls were making their way around, rice, grains, textiles, all sorts of other industrially manufactured goods, there was, of course, finance. And to finance this world of trade, many of these Gulf merchants kept accounts in Bombay's banks. And this is principally what Mohammed Salim al-Sdirawi was doing there. And you see him here, actually, you see a young, I want to see my cursor, if you can see my cursor, a young Mohammed Salim al-Sdirawi right here, standing behind his father, who passed away that same year from the plague in Bombay, when the plague hit Bombay. And Mohammed Salim al-Sdirawi, his father had been acting as a sort of commercial agent for Gulf merchants in Bombay. By the time Sdirawi took over, much of that work was in finance, and he kept accounts in more than a dozen banks and was constantly circulating different bills of exchange, different currency notes around the Indian Ocean. Much of his archive, his collection, is roughly 15,000 pages alone of correspondence. It involves the sort of coming and going of, or sort of circulation of different financial notes or financial instruments. And Bombay was not only a commercial staging post for these merchants, although I'm principally interested in it right now, I should say, as a commercial staging post. For many of them, Bombay was home. They built lives and communities there, and many of them died there, leaving families behind, some of whom remain there to this day. And there's a Gulf graveyard in Bombay as well. This is one of the couple of projects that I'm sort of toying with moving forward, a sort of very small, focused sort of set of microhistories on Arab Bombay. But who knows if I'll ever write it. Bombay, because Bombay was not just a center of commerce, Bombay was also a center for Arab printing. Beginning in the late 19th century, Gulf Arabs and others regularly printed books in Bombay. They printed manuals on the pearl trade and on navigation, treatises on religious thought, and other topics. They also consumed and financed Arab printing elsewhere. The story of the Arab intellectual renaissance, the Nahdha, in the 19th and 20th century is one that's often rooted in histories of thinkers, editors, and journalists in the Eastern Mediterranean. Arab merchants of Bombay were active consumers of publications produced in Egypt and the Levant. They subscribed to different newspapers and journals there and would circulate them to readers in the Gulf, and they helped expand a growing Arab public sphere. But they also helped finance many of these presses over there. The Gulf merchants frequently sent money to journalists in the Levant and hosted journalists from the Levant. The journalist Abdul Masih Antaki, of the editor and writer for the journal Al Umran, was a regular visitor to Sderawi and kept up a sort of vibrant correspondence with him. Jassim al-Ibrahim also, and others like him, also regularly hosted visits from Arab intellectuals, including Rashid Rida, whose writings they financed and who wrote glowing recollections of his time in Bombay, and Roy Barsadeh just published something on this very recently. So the profits they generated from their trade in Bombay went in part to finance the emergence of a trans-regional public sphere, one that connected the Indian Ocean world to the Mediterranean, but also one that financed publications within the Indian Ocean itself. They also inserted themselves into the fabric of industrial capitalism in Bombay through other means, through steamship companies. Gulf merchants in Bombay established at least two different steamship companies in the early 20th century, Arab Steamers Limited and the Persian Gulf Steam Navigation Company. Al-Sudayrawi was the managing director of the Persian Gulf Steam Navigation Company and held very close relations with Arab steamers as well. You can see why I would want to write a series of microhistories of Arab Bombay, because I have this one person who's just connected to virtually everything that happens there. These merchants would purchase discharged steamships, usually passenger liners from European companies, and then refit them as cargo ships. They ultimately get pushed out of the steamship market, but that's not really the point. The point is that they thought it was possible, and they made use of all of the institutional forms available to them in Bombay to do this sort of a thing, to enter into this world of steamship navigation. The history of the Gulf community at Bombay is a little unusual in some respects, or exceptional maybe in some respects, but in other ways it's not. And we can tell similar stories, though maybe not so quite multi-layered, on Gulf traders in Aden, Karachi, Calicut, Porbandar, and elsewhere in the Indian Ocean. So far, I've suggested a few different vectors of connection, of entanglement between the Gulf and wider Indian Ocean. We see how industrial transformations in Karachi and Bombay remake foodways in the Gulf, remake fashion sensibilities in the Gulf, and open up possibilities for Gulf merchants to embed themselves in a world of global finance and circulation. Colonial capitalism echoed into economic life in the Gulf in ways that we have not fully appreciated. We also see how these places become staging points for the history of Arab thought as well. All of this, and I've said nothing about empire as such, and I am actually not going to say very much about empire in this talk, though I welcome questions on it. There's a lot more to say about this project, that project of Gulf merchants in the Indian Ocean and connecting the Gulf to the Indian Ocean through merchants. And so far I've been talking at that scale, at the mercantile scale, the meso-level scale, or maybe the macro scale. But for the rest of this talk, I'd like to bring us back down to the micro scale, to the crooked, and back to Felichawi. So let's get back to the logbook, which, as it turned out, actually contained much more than the log of the voyage itself. Oh, well, there you go, just in case you forgot what he looked like. From the first page of the logbook, this is what I found. So there is something of a colophon or a note on when the logbook entered into his possession, and a very brief note on his own background. And then there were two acknowledgements of debt and a note laying out instructions for reading a compass. And this immediately threw me off when I opened up the logbook and I saw this. Why would anybody have this sort of a thing in a logbook? And as soon as you turn the page, you can see you can get a peek of the page right behind it. It just launches right into the log of the voyage. And I thought, how odd that he decided to include this, but also how very interesting, given that I had just written a book on debt and thinking about debt contracts. But as it turned out, these were not the only ones. In the other logbooks, there were actually many of these, many similar contracts covering all sorts of different situations. There were acknowledgements of debt, some of them linked specifically to different kinds of commodities like rice. And rice, we should say, is not just for consumption on board the dhow, but rice was the principal form of the sort of the principal modality of debt between mariners and their ship captains was through rice. That was a principal sort of link in the chain of obligation. They were advanced bags of rice, which if they wanted to convert to cash, which they didn't always want to convert to cash, if they wanted to convert to cash, they had to go and sell on the marketplace. There were also contracts here for loading and freighting dates, which was, of course, the principal cargo that Al-Felichawi and other nakhodas carried at the time. And there were what we might call money orders, hawalas, requests from one person to transfer money over to another port city. What struck me about these documents is how much they mapped onto a world of documents out there in the marketplace. Punctuating virtually every moment in the movement of the dhow around the Gulf and Western Indian Ocean were different financial and legal instruments. There are contracts, notes, orders, receipts, accounts, Arabic, Persian, Gujarati, English, sometimes 2 or 3 of these languages at once. And these form the documentary infrastructure of the marketplace. But although the contracts inscribed into Al-Felichawi's logbook point to a broader world of contracting, they're not actual contracts. I want to draw your attention to the dates. There are actually too many contracts that take place on the same date, the 22nd of Muharram, 1341, which is roughly 1923, I believe. There's no way that he could have entered into all of these contracts, or why would he have written down all the contracts from the same date, with the exception of 1 or 2 that are on different dates here. But the debt giveaway is the one contract here on the bottom right, in which there are actually no names in the contract itself. Let me zoom in for you. The contracting parties here are referred to as Fulan bin Fulan, literally so-and-so, son of so-and-so. And actually all of the other contracts, or most of the other contracts, include generic names, Ahmed, Muhammad, Hassan, Ali, things like that. And so we have various degrees of abstraction and anonymization here. And these contracts, I came to appreciate, help us trace the movement from the specific to the generic. Reading Al-Felichawi's different contractual templates together, we can get a sense of the different legal forms that punctuated the itinerary of the dhow, the matrices of rights and obligations, the multiple temporalities, the genres that shape the movement of people and goods and money. But more than that, it forces us to come to terms with the process of thinking and learning about these forms. By stripping them of the elements that gave them legal force, by essentially rendering them generic, Fulan bin Fulan, or some generic name like Ahmed bin Muhammad, or even taking out things like dates, by stripping them of those elements, but retaining the formulas that gave them their shape, Al-Felichawi opened up the possibility of reanimating the documents, reanimating these contracts whenever he needed them to. What we see here is legal thinking in motion, moving from the world of contracts out there onto the page of the notebook and then back out again. And the logbook is not, this is not the only place in the logbook where we see this sort of active thinking. There are all sorts of different notes in the logbook. Remember that note on how to use a compass? As it turned out, that was not the only one either. Alongside these notes were notes on navigation. In fact, there were more notes on navigation than there were on contracting. Throughout the logbook, he lays out different principles, different tips for navigation, and inscribes different data points. I will say this, and I'll sort of leave it as a teaser. Much of this is not actually written by Al-Felichawi himself. It's written by his teacher, and I'll be happy to talk much more about that. But there are some that are very clearly written in his hand. Some of these notes actively reference other authors, like the famous 15th century Arab navigator Ahmed ibn Majid, who authored the Kitab al-Fawaid. Whereas others are more sort of, it's less clear where the notes come from. Rather than think of these as just functional notes on navigation, we might better understand them as sort of indicating a textual universe within which this kind of movement takes place. Through his notes, we see El-Felichawi's engagement with a literary tradition, and we see this. We can say this because we know what books he is reading because we have the books. Over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, nakhodas from around the Gulf produced writing on various aspects of navigation in the Indian Ocean world. They produced sailing manuals, nautical almanacs, produced manuals on weighing and valuing pearls, on managing accounts, all sorts of different things. What I'm gesturing towards here is a history of ideas coming out of this sea of texts that moves alongside the dhow. El-Felichawi actively read these. He reads Ahmed ibn Majid, of course, but also more contemporary nakhodas like Isa al-Ghatami, who published a number of different texts at this time period. He consumes these texts, he copies principle and data from them into his notebook, and he renders that knowledge portable. And again, it's important to note that he did not actually inscribe most of those notes into his notebook, and I'm happy to talk about that. In a sense, we can think of these texts as part of the itinerary. These ideas form part of the infrastructure of circulation in this oceanic world. They don't exist in the abstract ether of intellectual history. They're actively engaged with and inscribed into the voyage itself. But that's only one dimension of how circulation happened. Part of enabling circulation is also moving in the other direction by making something tangible into something intangible, by taking something and abstracting it. And a note in Felichawi's book offers us clues for thinking about that process. In one note, he explores the process by which a cut of lumber is measured and converted into different units of measurement, the kandi and its subdivisions. This is not just a theoretical exercise. Nakhodas from the Gulf routinely called at the Malabar coast, specifically in Calicut, although they went to Mangalore as well. And in Calicut, they would purchase cargoes of timber that they would then take back to the Gulf. They'd use that timber for shipbuilding, but also in some cases for home construction. They sailed to Malabar so regularly that one Kuwaiti merchant, Yusuf Aslegar, in the front and center of the picture here, decided that he would set up a business office there. Aslegar would contract with timber merchants in the Malabari interior, and they would order for logs of teak and other kinds of wood to be cut and floated down the Beypore River, which emptied into the Arabian Sea right at Calicut. This process of cutting down trees into logs of timber that were marked for specific purposes, we all recognize it. It's the process by which nature becomes commodified through a network of merchants, brokers, and transactions. The note here, though, tells us that there's something that happens alongside that, a process by which that natural product becomes abstracted. By converting timber into its kandi value, the nakhoda converts a known tangible object with unique characteristics into a variable that can then enter into account ledgers. And all of these measures ultimately make their way into the shipyards of the Gulf. So we have circulating terminology, circulating measures in this world. There are many other examples of this that I could have talked about, and I do talk about in my book. The point, though, is that the process of moving goods involved more than just carrying them through physical space. It involved translating them into forms that were commensurable across market spaces. We might read all of this together. Sorry, I was not. We might read all of this together to think of the ways in which all sorts of useful knowledge circulated between different dhow captains and across generations. Circulation, something we invoke in Indian Ocean studies all the time, but we seldom actually think it through. Through a combination of manuals, models, and practice, we see navigational thinking and commercial legal practice move around the Indian Ocean world. All of these point to a process of forging shared conventions, but also a shared history of ideas and imaginaries. We might think of these nakhodas as thinkers, producing useful knowledge, categories for organizing the world around them. These people have a distinct way of giving their world a shape. They have ideas about it. And this is perhaps, to get back to where I was, this is perhaps the most glaring absence in the presentation of dhows like the Fath al-Khair. And there are many others like it, many other fatahs. It's not that you can't even climb onto the thing, which is a tragedy in and of itself, but it is that it is, in order to present it as a national icon, It needs to be stripped of the oceanic histories that propelled it to begin with. Others, like the crooked, did not even get that treatment. This is the crooked. Its carcass lay rotting on the banks of the creek at Ras Al Khaimah in the 1980s. Dhows like these cannot really move, have no place in a terrestrial national history. They existed in the vectors that connected the Gulf to India and East Africa, a world of circulating people, ships, goods, texts, ideas, a world animated by the intellectual labor that nakhodas like al-Felichawi engaged in to connect the dots. The project I presented you with is in many ways an experiment in microhistory on the move, what I call an oceanic microhistory. And this is what precisely al-Felichawi's writings offer us, a vista on at least some of the processes that conjured up a transregional world, one that's dispersed across coastal Arabia, India, and East Africa. If these are scattered histories, and I posit that they are scattered histories, it is by moving, by embracing mobility as a method in our writing, that we can begin to gather what's been scattered. And it's by grounding ourselves in the micro scale that we can begin to see the ways in which these pathways are infused with meaning. Thank you all very much.
Holy moly, that is amazing. I'm going to stop recording now and then I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions.